The first presentation was about an introduction to Vachanas in the context of Indian Bhakti and Siddha tradition, and the second one focused on one of the unique aspects of Vachana tradition, which is labor as soteriology, labor as a spiritual practice, which to the best of my mind is not found in any other Bhakti tradition. Today, I'm going to talk about the path of the path of the hand, the culture of the hand. This time, I want to talk about Bhakti. I called it the path of the heart. This is a tentative nomenclature. Now, when I was thinking about what to speak today, I think I need to change it into something else, but I'm not getting any alternative for the time being. So the path of the heart is the closest approximation of what I think Bhakti is in the context of Kannada Vachanas. A lot of literature on Bhakti available now, written by Indian authors and foreign authors and Indian foreign authors, have reflected on these traditions in terms of Eurocentric concepts, which are not quite germane to the evolution of Bhakti traditions in India. One of the biggest difficulties to talk about Bhakti traditions is to unlearn these statements these scholars have made, observations these scholars have made on Bhakti traditions, and look at it afresh. And one of the principles I have been following in my recent forays into Bhakti and spiritual traditions is to listen closely to what these texts are saying instead of imposing our own constructions, a priori constructions on it. Now, when we look at the definition of Bhakti in the existing literature, they fall into two classifications. One is to, like this habit of mind that Sanskritists have, to get the meaning of any word, you go to the etymology. And I think this is a big trap. Because in English, if you look at the C.T. Onion's etymology dictionary, the present-day English word boy, if you look at its etymology, it actually means girl. So the meaning has changed. So we have to look into the usage. So how Bhaktas themselves define Bhakti, that's what we should look closely at, and that's what we should listen closely to, than the constructions the scholars have, or also the constructions which have been ascribed to Bhakti traditions in post-Bhakti theologies. For example, I'll tell you what happened to Vachana tradition in Karnataka. 12th century, there was great efflorescence of Vachanas, though not all Vachanakaras belong to that period, at least the major ones did. And then this was in oral transmission for nearly 200 years, 300 years, and around the 15th century, this is called Vachana Sangopana Yuga, Age of Compilation of Vachanas, at the court of the Salva Emperor Prodhadevaraya, who ruled Vijayanagar, who gave, because this sect had become very popular perhaps, he gave it the royal patronage. That was the time when Vachanas were committed to writing, and they were compiled into anthologies and commentated upon. So at this time, the scholars who are not Bhaktas, who were trying to use Vachanas as a kind of cultural capital, they used them to for their own theological constructions, which accorded with their needs. So I'm not going into that. So a lot of, this point I also made in my previous presentations, a lot of things that have been written about Vachanas, both creative and critical literature, including my own play Mahachetra, have been based more on the constructions of 15th century scholars than on direct insights derived from Vachana texts themselves. Now that is a challenge I am facing now, to rethink the Vachanas through the texts of Vachana poets themselves. This is another trap here. Now, in the official the website of Vachana Sanchaya, which one of our great scholars, Nagbhushan Swami, has compiled, there are about 20,000 Vachanas. And he tells me that only 10% of them are authentic, because there were a lot of interpolations in Vachanas. Later, the same Vachanas were rewritten to suit the needs of appropriators at later periods. For example, terms from like dharma, karma, etc., and Vachanas which use long and endless quotations from scriptural literature, these appear to be belonging to the later period, and it's not difficult. It's difficult to prove because we're talking about manuscripts, and I don't have enough knowledge of manuscriptology to decide which comes first and which. But if you look at the typical Vachana, characteristic Vachanas of Allama or Basavana Rakama Devi, we know their language, and we know when there is some kind of replication of that by somebody else, that's easily detectable according to me. So these are the problems that we are facing. And plus, we should remember, like all Bhakti texts, Vachana texts are also fluent texts. There was a great Gujarati literary scholar, Professor Harwala Bhayani. Once he said that when we are dealing with Indian Bhakti traditions, Eurocentric scholarship is completely useless because they are looking at definitive texts, whereas in our Bhakti and folk traditions, what we have are fluent texts. Because even when you look at the manuscripts, every scribe brings in his own innovation to the text there. So it's like one has to be a good detective to guess what the original text could be about. So these are some of the problems involved. So I'm not talking about this problem, but we have to keep them in mind. And we know that the texts we are dealing with are fluent texts and not fixed texts. And some intelligent guesswork is needed while talking about or translating these texts. Now, today what I'm going to do is that I've been talking about Bhakti as the way of the heart. I quoted Utpalacharya and maybe Kulashekar Radwar and others. It is basically the path of the heart. But when we say that Bhakti is the path of the heart, Bhakti is unconditional love for the divine. This is a very general statement. And how exactly it works out in each one of the Bhakti traditions and in each one of the Vachana poets, in this case Vachanakaras, that needs to be looked into, and that's what I'm trying to do today. Now, there is one sectarian view of Bhakti. Many a times Vachanakaras are known to attack followers of other sect. The Vedic tradition, not just the Vedic tradition, the folk traditions and Jainas. There's nothing against Buddhists, because the Buddhists may not have been very influential in Karnataka at that time. For example, Vedas came to grief because they could not understand. Shastras came to grief because they could not demonstrate. Agamas came to grief because they could not be aware of anything. Puranas came to grief because they could not complete anything. So they reject all kinds of scriptures. And whoever does not follow the path of Sharanas, the Sharanas are called Bhaktas. Whoever does not follow the path, an outsider, they have a term for him called Bhavi. So time and again, Vachanakara says, Bhavi Sangava Madalaradu. That Bhavis include not only Vedic people, not only Agamic people, but also Shaivas who go and worship Shivalingam in the temples, Sthavarlingas. So this is one limiting view of bhakti which we find in Vachanas. And I think this kind of element eventually leads to militancy in devotional sects. This happened to Vaishnavism at some point of time. Something called Veera Vaishnavism came into being. Similarly, the militant Shaivism emerged more or less around this age of compilation. And the legends about one Eko Rami Tande and Adaya who went around destroying Jaina places of worship and slaughtering Jainas. There are legends about it. And that was the period, 15th and 16th century, when lots of Jaina lay people started committing what is called Sallekha Vrata or Pandita Marana. The wise about which Professor Shettar has written two fantastic books. And Shettar also surmises that proliferation of Sallekha Vratas and this voluntary death rituals of Jainas was occasioned by the onslaught of militant Virashaiva crusaders. So this element is already there in Vachanas. These days when they talk about Vachanas, they only talk about good things and they says, oh, you have universal, this, that and so on. But we should look into all the dimensions of Vachanas. And if one looks at the militant stand taken by the Lingayat community in the recent past, in case of many controversial books, including my own, it's not that Sharana worldview was all completely benevolent in those days, suddenly turned militant. There are seeds in the Vachana text in there, and we have to look at them objectively. So this Bhakta and Bhavi, this dividing line, is an important element of Vachana Bhakti, and which is the narrow understanding of Bhakti. For example, there is, okay. So Bhavi is the opposite of Sharana. And who is a Bhavi? Time and again they tell us, Parasati Paradana. Whoever appropriates the wealth of another person, woman of another person, is a Bhavi. But interesting thing is, this Bhakta Bhavi, this binary, is transcended by the most Catholic of Vachanakaras with greatest Catholicity, for example, Allama, ultimately upholds not the ideal of a Bhakta, but of a Bhavi. Now, there are two kinds of approaches to understanding of Bhakti. Bhakti is not the surrender of the heart, yes, but Bhakti is something physical. And the experience of Bhakti is similar to the erotic experience. So there is one of the words which is very frequently used in the description of Bhakti is doing it with the whole of the body, with the whole of the mind, with the whole of the self. Basavanna puts it in one of his vachanas, Maduvudu Manamutti. Maduvudu Tanimutti. Now, when it comes to Vachana poets of the artisan or laboring class, making refers to the act of labor. Here, Bhakti itself is a kind of action, and it has to be done with the body. here's this Vachana by ಮನ ಬೆರೆಸಿದಲ್ಲಿ ತನು ಕೆರಗದಿದ್ದರೆ. It's a Vachana by Basavana. It's a very beautiful verse. It's not yet been translated. I'm giving you a rough and ready translation. I thought I should dig out new Vachanas instead of using the ones I've already translated. Mana beresidalli tanu karagide is referring to human love. When the hearts meet, tanu karagide iddare, then the bodies should melt. Unless the bodies melt, ಸೋಂಕಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಪುಳಕಂಗಳು ಹೊರಹೊಮ್ಮದಿದ್ದರೆ, through touch, if that thrilling experience of thrill does not happen, ಕಂಡಾಗಲಷ್ಟು ಜಲಂಗರು ಸುರಿಯದಿದ್ದರೆ, it's like meeting of lovers. When they look at each other, their eyes are filled with tears. Unless tears flow, ನುಡಿವಲ್ಲಿ ಗದ್ಗದಂಗಳು ಪೊನ್ಮದಿದ್ದರೆ, when they speak to each other, they can't speak clearly. So that something, they feel some constriction in the throat. So they speak in a not very fluently. Unless this happens, ಕೂರ್ದ ಸಂಗಮ ದೇವರ ಭಕ್ತಿಗೆ ಚಿನ್ನ ಎನ್ನಲ್ಲಿ ವಿಲ್ಲಾಗೆ ಆನಂದಕರು. See, only when you have these things, it is a sign that you are a bhakta of Kural Sangama. Because I don't have them, I am not one. And Akkamadevi, one of her famous Vachanas, says, Tanu karagadavalalli pushpavanalli yeninu. Unless the body melts, you will not accept flowers from them. Mana karagadavalalli gandhakshatayanalli yeninu. Unless the heart melts, you will not accept sandals and the sacred rice from them. Arivu kantariya, unless the body melts and the heart melts, the awareness is not. Arivu kantariyadavalli, the opening of the inner eye is consequent upon the melting down of the body and the melting down of the mind. So, another Vachana by Basavana. The body itself is transformed into an image of bhakti. Yanna kayava dandigaya madayya. He is talking about the body as a lute. He says, make my body the beam of the lute. Yanna kayava dandigaya madayya. Yanna narava tantiya madayya. Make my nerves into the strings. Yanna berada kaddiya madayya. Make my fingers into the striker. Vurdalotti badisu. Clasp this lute to your heart. Bhakti saragava barisayya kura. Through that you play 32 ragas. Because probably in those days only 32 ragas of music were famous. He's talking about 32 ragas. So but the body itself becomes that lute, which is a symbol of bhakti. So the transformation of the body into the attitude of bhakti and the gestures of bhakti, like tears flowing and words failing and the body melting and the heart melting, etc., is no bhakti. This is another perception of bhakti in Vachanas. One is the sectarian perception, where bhakti is the preserve of their own sect, and followers of all other sects are called bhavis. But this is a more subjective and internal dimension of bhakti. And this bhakti, they tell us, is not easy. Sometimes it's not just love, it's also struggle. Basavana says in one of his Vachanas, Jambu dvipanava khanda prithviyodage ಕೊಲುವೆನೆಂಬ ಭಾಷೆ ದೇವನದು, ಗೆಲುವಿನೆಂದ ಭಾಷೆ ಭಕ್ತನದು, ಭಕ್ತಿ ಎಂಬ ಕೂರಲಗನೆ ಹಿಡಿದು ಸದ್ಭಕ್ತರು ಗೆದ್ದರು ಕಾಣ ಕುಡಿಲ ಸಂಗಮದೇವ. He says in Jambudvipa Navakhanda Prithvi, in those days the idea of cosmos was, the cosmos consisted of Jambudvipa, and there were 9 continents, they say, mythological concept of geography. Yaradalina Bhashe. Listen to the language of 2 people. Koluvenamba Bhashe Devanadu. I will kill you. This is the language of God. Geluvenamba Bhashe Bhakta, but I will win. This is the language of the Bhakta. Bhakti Yamba Kuralagane hididu, the sharp sword of Bhakti in hand. He compares Bhakti to a weapon. On the one hand, it's love, self-negating kind of love. Here is struggle. Bhakti is a sharp blade of Bhakti. Sadbhaktaru geddaru kana kudu sagamadeva. The true devotees can conquer you, O Kudal Sangamadeva. This language of struggle, Akkamadeva was known for vachanas which are lyrical, which is example of Madhurya Bhakti, devotional love. She also sometimes speaks like a fighting bhakta. She says, for Vachanas, she's talking to Basavana, she's describing her experience of bhakti. Kamariya ಗೆಲ್ಲಿದನು ಬಸವ ನಿಮ್ಮ ದಯೆಯಿಂದ, ಸೋಮಧರನ ಹಿಡಿತಪ್ಪೆನು ಬಸವ ನಿನ್ನ ಮನೆ ದಯೆಯಿಂದ, ನಾಮದಲ್ಲಿ ಹೆಂಗೂಸೆಂಬ ಹೆಸರಾದರೇನು, ಭಾವಿಸಲು ಗಂಡು ರೂಪು ಬಸವ ನಿಮ್ಮ ದಯದಿಂದ, ಅತಿ ಕಾಮಿ ಚನ್ನ ಮಲ್ಲಿಕಾರ್ಜುನಂಗೆ ತೊಡರಿಕ್ಕಿ ಎರಡುವರೈಯದೆ ಕೂಡಿದನು ಬಸವ ನಿಮ್ಮ ದಯೆಯಿಂದ. Says Shiva is the enemy of lust, Kamari, according to mythology. So the greatest conqueror is the conqueror of lust. He is that. But I am going to conquer it. She deliberately used the word Kamari, the conqueror of the greatest biological force. So I'll conquer this conqueror of lust. Kamariya. Gelidinu Basava. I've already conquered him, O Basava, through your grace. Somadharana hiditappenu Basava ninadayinda. He is one whose decked is crowned with the moon. And I'm going to capture him and bring him to you. So don't think I'm a woman. Namadalli hengu semba hesaradenu. What if I'm called a woman? I'm a woman only in name. Bhavisalu gandu rupu. If you understand me from within, intuitively, I am a he. Nimadayedinda. Even that is because of your grace. Ati kami channa mallikarjunange todarikki. First she said Channa Mallikarjuna is Kamari, enemy of Kama. Now she says Ati Kami. He is a very licentious person. So I will set an obstacle to this lascivious, this lech, and then I'll mate with him and overcoming duality in that sense, in an undivided way. Basavani Makrapenda. So the culmination is an act of love, act of intimate love, where 2 bodies melt into one, but the path to arrive at this kind of union is full of struggle. So bhakti is both the battleground and also the bed of union for a bhakta. And Basavana also talks about this. In the Vachana, he talks about unless these things happen. Again, he also talks about the struggle involved in bhakti. Elsewhere, he says, Bhakti ambuda madavaradaya hogutta varutta garagasadante koyyuvudu. Bhakti is not an easy thing. It, like a seesaw, it cuts you while going and coming. So, what we should focus on, what I want to emphasize is, bhakti is not something easy. It's not just an act of faith. Now we are talking about different kind of bhakts today. I don't want to talk about it. You just believe. Bhakti is not based on faith. Bhakti is experiential. For Ramakrishna Paramahamsa, Kali was not an object of faith. Kali was part of his experience. Bhakti is experiencing the divine through intense love, and intense love is inseparable from intense hate, because human mind always acts between opposites. In Buddhist meditation, we are taught that there are two impulses which disturb a meditator. One is kamachanda, which is lust and passion. The other is vyapa, the opposite, antagonism, hatred. So in intense act of love, there is this complexity, and which we find in the language of Vachanas. And this militant bhakti that we discover in Vachanas, this militancy is not with the other. The militancy against other is based on the concept of bhakta and bhavi. But this militancy that in the Vachanas I said is not a struggle with others, but the struggle with oneself. Perhaps historians should have the last word about it. This Veera Bhakti concept came to our Indian Bhakti schools maybe because of the influence of Islamic concept of jihad, because we don't see this prior to 8th century. But about jihad also, there are two approaches to it. One is the political approach to consider jihad as a crusade against the other. There is a Sufi concept of jihad where the fight is with yourself, not with others. So conquering the enemy within. So this element of bhakti, subjective aspect of bhakti, is different from the social aspect of this militancy. They have to be kept separate, but both of them are present in the Vachanas. And now, next thing is, Bhakti is the path, and people, I've already told you that we can't afford to confuse this kind of unconditional love or obsession with the divine with other kinds of matlabi bhakti, temple-going bhakti and ritual performing bhakti, where bhakti is always for a prize, for a boon. In a lot of devotional hymns, we find this, what is called Palashruthi. What are the things, boons you are going to get if you chant these verses? If you chant one time, you'll get all this, 2 times a day you get all this, and 3 times a day you get all this. Maybe people get it, but this is Masindri Bhakti. And this is not the kind of bhaktas we're talking about. I explained the difference to you. in my first lecture by giving the example from Andal's Tirupavai. But there is a point when bhakti transcends bhakti. Even in other traditions, the dualism between the bhakta and the divine, ultimately the two merge into one. In Sufic tradition, this is a legend about Mansur Halaj, who in divine ecstasy, he started screaming, Anal Haq, Anal Haq, Anal Haq, I am Allah and I am Allah. And he was persecuted. And there's another story connected with this. His sister, Rabia Basri, was a great mystic, according to this legend. And every day she used to partake of a divine wine, which only enlightened people can withstand. He caught her sipping this wine. He said, give it to me. He says, what is this? This takes you into great ecstasy. He says, give it me, I want to taste it. He said, no, you can't stand it. You will come to ruin yourself if you don't have the energy to stand it. So he insisted, and at last he agreed to give him a drop of it. As soon as he drank one drop of it, suddenly he went into the ecstasy and went out into the street screaming, Allah, Allah. So he was persecuted. So, the path of bhakti is not difficult, and it is not only a path of self negation, sometimes it's also the path of self-destruction, because in that state, even German mystic Mr. Eckhart says in one of his sayings, I and my Father are one. Even in a dualistic religion like Christianity, he says, I and my Father are one. So the same kind of union these Vachana poets also attain at the end of their long journey, journey full of struggles and full of the pangs of separation and the thrills of momentary union, and it has follows the same course as human love, intense human love, but the object of this love is different. And the difficulty of falling in love with somebody who is not embodied is an important aspect of Vachana Bhakti. For example, in Vaishnava Bhakti, in Saguna Bhakti, Krishna has very palpable attributes. A lot of bhajans, devotional songs to Krishna talk about it. Kasturi tilakam lalata palake, vakshastale kaustubham, nasagya harichandanam, karatale venum kare kanganam, gopasti pariveshtitam, vijayate govinda chudamanim, vijayate gopala chudamanim. So he is described in the last chapter of Sri Narayaniyam by Narayana Bhattapadri. Narayaniyam is a great devotional Sanskrit. It is written in Kerala, which is the condensed translation of Srimad Bhagavatam, one of the most important Vaishnava Bhakti texts. And it's got very intense description of Krishna, very poetic, immensely poetic. The description of the image of Kuruvayurappan from the head to foot. Intense. So there is a concrete representation of a deity there. But in Vachanas, because Tamil Bhakti is the first Saguna Bhakti, the Bhakti of Sharana is the first Nirguna Bhakti in India, the Shiva here is, for the most part, formless. And even if he has form, he does not have the anthropomorphic form. In one of his Vachanas, Jagadagala, Migayagala, Migilagala, Nimmagala, wide as the earth. and wider than all the worlds. Patadin datta nimma Shri Charana. Your feet go further down than the underworlds. Brahmandin datta nimma Shri Makuta. Your crown is further above the cosmic egg. Agamya, agochara, apratimaliнгаве. Agamya, you're unreachable. Agochara, you're unperceivable. But how come that you became my slave? So how the immensity, cosmic immensity, becomes something I can hold in my hand. And in another Vachana, there is a Vachanakara called Gajesha Masanaya. He says in one of his Vachanas, you girls of the world, you are able to, you attain joy by making love to your boyfriends in your dreams, even when they are not around. But I can't even do that because I haven't even seen my boyfriend. I don't know how he looks. So this agony of falling in love with somebody who is disembodied. Kamadevi also says, bhavavillada, bhayavillada, gandaninganolidenava. Is the husband without birth, without marks, without face. Elsewhere it says, the husband without the head marries the bride without her legs. So this marriage between the bhakta and sharana and the formless divine is sometimes invoked in a paradoxical language. Allama Prabhu also talks about, though Allama Prabhu is not predominantly a bhakta, Kandalanureda, Huttanureda, Bhandanava, Ati Bhandanava, Kandarenudisade Maya Devi. So Kandala means the vessel, the pot. But our Vachana scholars were unable to find out the meaning of this word, and one great scholar, Professor Aramitra, he found the meaning of this word in the Malayalam dictionary. In the Malayalam dictionary, Kandalu means the vagina. Kandala Noreda. And this is meaning is confirmed by the next line, Huttanumurida. He broke the penis, Huttanumurida. Bhandanavati Bhandanav. It's this kind of love he makes. And this love is very, Akkamadeva says, Appidare Asthigalu Muriyuvantirebeku. While embracing, the bones should be pulverized. Yachare Garita Kanadantirebeku. And when you shoot the arrow in love, and even that, whatever thing you have at the edge of that, the gari, the feather that is tied to the arrow, even that should go in. So it's that kind of intense love. So bhakti works through the body. Like the approach of tantras and yoga also works through the body. Bhakti also works through the body, and it seeks to transform the body. It's body-centric, but the body is transformed into something. So this is a very important thing that we'll see in Vachanas. And now I can go on, but I would like to conclude with the remaining, the missing links. I can address them in my question and answer any questions. Now I said Bhavi is supposed to be the opposite of Bhakta. But Allama Prabhu reverses this. In those Vachanas he says, Bettakya Chadiyadareno Hudisuvaraya. If mountains feel the cold, with what will they cover them? Bayalu battal yiddare urisuraya. When void is naked, what do they cover it with? Bhakta bhaktana bhaviyadre adena upasivisoenaya. If the bhakta becomes a bhavi, to what similes should I find for it? And a lot of scholars, they say that Allama Prabhu is talking about how bad it is to be a bhavi. You have to be a bhakta. But look at the metaphors. Allama Prabhu speaks the language of paradoxes. He says, bhakta should ultimately become free from bhakti, should again become a bhavi. So, bhaktanu bhavi, that process of bhakta becoming bhavi is similar to the mountains feeling the cold. There is no blanket to cover it. Or space being naked. You don't say, oh, shame, and you try to cover the shame of the space with a piece of cloth. So, bhakti has to go beyond bhakti. Another Vachana, Allama Prabhu says, the goal is not to be a bhakta. The goal of a bhakta is to become a bhavi. Elsewhere it says, Kuruha nididu kuruha galla badlade. If you are a bhakta, all these signs, like the Ishtadevata, the form Ishtadevata, some kinds of rituals, some kinds of name, image, etc. I said, these are all signs. And to become liberated, you have to go beyond. Kuruha nididu kuruha. By following these, by focusing on this symbol or sign, you have to transcend the symbol. And he says in one of his Vachanas, bhavi bija vrukshada phaladodage bhakti bija vruksha pallavasittu. The seed of bhakti is bhavihood. And that's that one has to become a bhakta. One is a bhavi to start with. Bhakti bija vrukshada phaladodage sharana bija vruksha pallavasittu. And in that bhakti, the sharanahud, the specific kind of bhakti that Vachana poets are talking about, it came from the seed of bhakti. Sharana bijada vrukshada phaladodage kulanashaka harana munde basuralli banda. And from this seed of Sharana, there came another who is the destroyer of his own clan, Kulanashaka. Bandhu baragakke tanna kulakke tane mariyada. He became the ruin of his own clan, his own community. Bhavi bhakta, bhavi bija vuksha tampunarada bittu. So by going beyond the cooling shade of bhaktahood and bhavihood, kulirdalliye badi badiya sharana, the bayalada sharana, the true sharana turned into void wherever he was sitting. One doesn't need to be a bhakta, one doesn't need to be a bhavi. One has to go beyond these binaries. And in the next lecture, I'm going to talk about this, what it feels like to go beyond and live beyond these binaries on the basis of some more Vachana texts. But before I conclude, so I said North Indian Bhakti scholars have talked about two kinds of Bhakti, Saguna Bhakti and Nirguna Bhakti. Saguna Bhakti where the divine has an anthropomorphic form, and Nirguna Bhakti where the divine does not have the anthropomorphic form. And the example of Saguna Bhakti in Hindi is Goswami Tulsidas, and Kabir, Ravidas, Dadu Dayal, their representatives Nirguna Bhakti. It's a question of Sakara and Nirakara, the form and the formless. Ultimate spiritual experience is beyond both. Allama puts it very beautifully, and this will be a kind of a concluding vachana for today's lecture, and this will be a trailer of the next lecture. He says, Sakara nirakarangadam bevaru surupangadu. Both form and formless are abstractions or constructions. Vandu ahvana. When you imagine in the anthropomorphic form, whichever the form of light, in the form of cross, whichever form you want, this is invocation, vandu ahvana. And when you go beyond this form into the formless, vandu visarjana. So, okay, I'll take it there. These are the hazards of losing weight, the rings come loose. So, vandu visarjana, the other is dissolution. Vandu vyakula, the form is ultimately sorrow, because the joy of union soon brings the pangs of separation. It's vyakula. So long as in the domain of form, you can't escape the dualism of agony and ecstasy. One is nirakula, the other is nirakula. It has no limitations. But he says, Ubhaya kuda rahita nama Gogeshwaranu. And Gogeshwara, our Lord, is beyond both these clans of the form and the formless. So there's another saying among the Vachana poets, Bayala alayava maduvanu bhakta. That bhakta is somebody who gives shape, a form. The Alaya means temple, it doesn't mean temple because Vachana poets didn't believe in the temple. Is bhakta. Alayava bayalu maduvanu jangama. Jangama, who is not a bhakta, you can't say it's knowledge, it's something like wisdom, the wise one. The adept is somebody who can dissolve form into nothing. The artisan Vachana poets who look at the act of labor as a path of liberation, as a soteriology, they transcend their ego through labor, dissolve the ego, and bhaktas dissolve it through intense love. When I and you become one and both are negated, and the other is the approach to go from void to void to void. You don't even need to break the body to know that it's empty. It's rather, Devaradasi the Dasamaya, the Viva says in one of the Vachanas, Ghatava nodedu, Ditava nodaleke. Why should we break the body to see the truth of word inside? Ghatave, Ditavendride solidity. Why not realize that the body itself is empty? And Kabir puts it in a different way. Jal mein kumbh mein jal bahar bhitar pani, tote kumbh jal jahi samana ih tat katyo jnani. So there is pot, water is the symbol of emptiness here. Water, if you dip the pot in water, there's water inside and water outside. If the pot breaks, water is still the water. So this is as far as words can approximate the void that our great mystics are talking about. So I conclude here. If there are any questions, I'll answer.
And are all bhakti movements basically non-dualist at the end? The union is the central thing, or are there dualist bhakti traditions also?
See, that's going into theology, but I think some bhakti traditions do not transcend dualism. For example, in Haridasa composition, Ninyako nina hangyako nina namada balaviddare sako. They reject the deity. Your name is enough, but name is the ultimate thing. But in Advaita Bhakti, you have to go even beyond the name. Nama Nema Rahita, Lama puts it in his Vachanas. So, if Bhakti experience is expressed within the framework of a theology, then there's this problem. But if you look at the compositions of, I'm not saying that all Vaishnava Panthas are, dualistic. If you look at the abhangs of Ovis of Gnaneshwar and Tukaram, they sometimes transcend this dualism. Tukaram says in one of his abhangs, when I was walking along, I saw Panduranga standing close to a basil plant, standing with a tulsi mala on his, and this peacock feather on his head. And I just flapped my eyelid. When I opened it, it had become Nirakara. So, if we are talking from their experience, they recognize the relativity of both form and the formless. But those who are trying to illustrate a theology through constructing this bhakti, which I always consider to be second or third rate bhakti, they fall into these disputes. Bhakti is basically experience, it's not theology. And some people make bhakti of bhaktas the cultural capital when they build institutions and for various political reasons.
Two small things. You said in the beginning that most of the scholarship about Vachanas is sort of restricted or influenced basically by the construction made in 15th century when the Vachanas were. And now, including yourself, you said that you were also looking at it. And that now you want to look at it from the text itself, the Vachana themselves, without anybody else telling you.
Without minimum mediation of other concepts.
So has this change come about in you, I'm asking, because of your studies of, let's say, modern thinkers like Derrida, or is it something different? That's one. Mm-hmm. The second thing is that the way you describe the ultimate of bhakti, the union, it could mean as if in the end, it's a total dissolution, of course, in a sense, and nothing to do with society after that. But I think that even a person like among the Vachangaras, Allama Prabhu is one who has experienced perhaps the highest spiritual experience and expression. And he said that Soham embudu hedu, hedi dasohava mardiddare atigadena anu duheshwara. Means consideration for others. The dasohava, I certainly don't treat it as some giving food to somebody or charity. The general concern for others. I think that is what your ultimate achievement in the bhakti must bring you to that. Am I right in saying that?
Yes and no. The first question is about how did my outlook on Vachanas change. It's not just because of my textual reading, not just because of these newfangled theories from post-war Europe, which according to me have no relevance whatever in India, except they are very useful for some university intellectuals like professors of JNU and Central University of Hyderabad to get foreign fellowships and so on. This is purely mercenary reasons. They have no relevance at all. And I don't want to go there at all to understand Vachanas or Bhakti traditions. This change has happened to me because of my own spiritual practice. And I have not been talking about the spiritual aspect of Vachanas because most people don't like it. But Vachanas, you should remember, are the expressions of people who were intense sadhakas, and Vachanas express the different stages of their, experiencing of that. That's how I look at Kabir or whichever great Tukaram or Sant Gyaneshwar and so on. Secondly, second question was about what good is it for the society? Now, when we are in a dualistic state of mind, we think society is outside. We have to be do-gooders to work for society. But when you are the state of unitive knowledge, the whole world is within you. One Sufi poet puts it very beautifully. What's his name? He was in France, I forget. I'll remember his name in a bit. He says, when I open my eyes, I'm a drop in the ocean of the world. When I shut my eyes, the world is a drop in the ocean of the self. So Allama has reached that state. But this Vachana that you quoted, I have to check whether it is Allama's Vachana or it is an interpolated Vachanas. Later, when so-called Lingayat theology developed, they put in all such abstractions in the Vachanas. The language of Vachana poets is very concrete, it's immediate. To use the not a very respectable expression, it's like somebody is squeezing your balls. You get that kind of experience. So intense as that. But when you look at this, if you look at the later Vachanakaras, like Swatantra Siddhalingeshwara said, they are theological Vachanas. They're making Vachanas out of concepts which are not part of their experience. But Vachanas, it's like touching an oven, you can feel the heat immediately. The impact is physical, it's not cerebral. So probably this is an interpolated Vachana, even if it is not. I know this Vachana. What he's talking about is, you have to follow the symbol, follow the path of humility to attain union with the ultimate. Elsewhere he talks about Vagadvaita. Harida haruvanobba, Harida sira hidadekondo, Adhyatma vikara nettara kudidanu. People who don't speak of Advaita. Speaks of a Brahmin who has cut off his own head and drinking his own blood. He compares this kind of Advaita to the image of Chinnamasta. Elsewhere he says, Kayye lingavagi, Baye bhagavagi, Umbuva tuttvagallellavu binduvaagire bereko Advaita. So Advaita you're experiencing every moment, even when you're eating. He says, your fingers are the linga and your mouth is the yoni, and every morsel of food you take inside is bindu. Then why talk about Advaita as something different from this experience? So the language of Vachanas is translucent. It's not we should not look into accept the theological vachanas. It has the elusiveness and translucency of very complex poetry. You have to read between the lines, you have to look between the words and beyond words into the experience. Like, if we focus too much on the text, we lose what they are trying to point out to you. Like they say it in the Zen saying, when somebody points at the moon, if you look too much at the finger, you'll miss that heavenly glory. And a lot of Vachana scholars have done that.
This is with regard to what you said in the beginning about the militant aspects to be found in the bhakti. Is it always associated with this kind of Dvaita bhakti? And that seems to be working out even today. And we don't see the mathas, etc., in the Vachana movement itself, but later on, even forming these mathas and clinging to their pride and invoking this kind of something, their uniqueness, and then clinging to that and saying that is the bhakti, which also raises another important question for today as to, is there actually a sentiment called the religious sentiment at all? Because if you take bhakti as sentiment, is there a sentiment? I don't know if the psychologists agree to that. Is there a sentiment as religious sentiment at all?
Religious sentiment is different than bhakti. A lot of people go to temple and there are places of pilgrimage like Tirupati. The god of Tirupati is the Shah Rukh Khan of Indian gods. People go there. For various reasons. I'm not making fun of them. Good. I also used to do that whenever I was in fear or felt threatened. But that is not bhakti. And when I used to teach my bhakti class in JNU, my students would ask me, do you find any such bhaktas now? I couldn't point at Jaggi Vasudevan or Sri Ravi Shankar or that Ram Rahim or Asaram as bhaktas. They're some kind of, what should I say, some manufacturers or some bhakti. Bhakti is humility, and bhakti is self and is subjective, and so that kind of institutionalization, it kills the element of bhakti. That's when bhakti becomes theology, and a lot of people need it. If so long as there is people who comes to the dead point in their lives, when nothing works, look beyond, there has to be that feeling of bhakti, because it's deeply ingrained in human beings. So long as human beings are there, so long as such, what William James called structural changes in personality happen, the mystical longings, they come into being. So that is my answer. And this militant bhakti, how it starts, I think this is a socio-political question. When a community feels threatened by the real or imaginary other, then it leads to militant kind of collective self-assertion. For example, if you look at the history of Sikhism. Sikhism was a pacific religion. Even Guru Arjun Dev was, slaughtered by Mughal rulers. It didn't become a militant religion. But when things went too far, Dasham Guru, Guru Gobind Singh, had to make it a militant religion, not because Guru Gobind Singh was anti-Muslim. He was only opposed to Aurangzeb's tyranny. and he wrote a letter to Aurangzeb saying why Aurangzeb was a fake Muslim. So he was such deep understanding of Islamic theology also. So when their the collective self of any community or sect is threatened, they go militant. But we can't say, in case of Sikhism, the threat was real. But in other cases, like when the Nazism rose in Europe, whether this threat of Jews was real or half real or whatever, we have to look into that. And sometimes imaginary others, fears of imagined others can also be propagated in society.
No, but here, between the Shaivas and the Vaishnavas, Shaivas and the Jains,
This happened because when Shaivas were dominant, when Shaivism became it got patronage, royal patronage, they started flexing their muscles. And if you look at any temple in Karnataka, if you go to a lot of temples which were originally Jaina temples, were later, one point of time they became Shaivite, and later when Vaishnava kings came, they became Vaishnavite. In this Kashmiri text, Rajatarangini, there is some episode where when the Vaishnava king comes to power, he loots the Shaiva temples and so on. So this political appropriation of religious sects was always there. And I don't know whether we should see the bhakti of these great saints and their expression as an integral part of this political appropriation of bhakti. The two have to be kept separate. But if there are some seeds of this militancy in the expressions of this Vachanas, those bhaktas, that we should be aware of. For example, most of our bhakti sects indulge in paramata khandana, pulling down the other sects. Not all of them. Allama never does that. He doesn't. Not other sects. He is talking about all dishonest, use of spirituality. Is not against any. Allama doesn't talk about any particular sects. Basavana does. Akmadeva sometimes does. So that intolerance of other sects. You have such elements in Vachanas themselves. But also one has to look at the authenticity of these Vachanas, which is another big task we have, because scholars have taken this for granted that if the book edited by El Basavaraj, you have Allama's Vachana, it's by Allama. Because if you look at the Vachana texts themselves in Basavaraja's edition, only the first 714 Vachanas, that's the first bundle, and later it's a Hechina Vachanas, additional Vachanas. And in the additional Vachanas, you have a lot of these things. There's also a Vachana in this text where there's a mention of Bijara's assassination, and Bijara is referred to as a Jain. Number one, Allama can't have written this. Number two, Bijara was never a Jain. Later, legends had it that he was a Jain, and Jains wrote a text called Bijara Deva Charite, where they made Basavana the villain. And this was edited and published by the great Jnanpith winner, Master Venkatesh Iyengar. There was deep bad blood between Sri Vaishnavas and Veerashaivas, and we know that during this Veera Vaishnavas and Veera Jangamas came into conflict, that during the time of Chikkadeva Bhupa, this Veera Vaishnavas invited the Jangamas for a grand lunch somewhere in the outskirts of Mysore, and they were trapped them there and slaughtered all of them. And it's a historical event. So this intersect violence was also happening. And they're saying in Tamil, Shivalayate Puga went down. So Vireshnath, don't look at the entire Shivalaya. Until very recently it was there. For example, I remember a short story by Guru Ramaswamy Iyengar, where two, a Brahmin boy and a Brahmin girl, fall in love. One is a Sri Vaishnava, other is a Smarta, and then they're not accepted by society, and both of them commit suicide at the end. So the intersect hatred and violence was part of our social history, but it's not part of our spiritual genealogy. That's how I look at it.
With regard to this Vachanas or any of this Bhakti literature being used, it's not only the scholars who have edited, the oral tradition itself has many readings. Is it not possible that the followers themselves have also done this kind of interpolation, not necessarily the editors of the 20th century or so on? Even before that, they had different versions which they had to edit. And is it not, I mean, it's not fair perhaps to put the blame entirely on the scholars who worked on it rather than the followers, because the bhaktas are not only the bhaktas who have written this, even those who followed, who carried on this oral tradition are also bhaktas. And they have their...
Yes. It's a very simple question. The followers of bhaktas are not always bhaktas. So they're fanatical people. And the difference is, genuine bhaktas, nija bhaktas, in Vachanas you have the word nija bhakta. Nija bhaktas are rooted in their experience. Bhaktas of bhaktas, these duplicate bhaktas, they believe in some version of this bhakti and they take to it militantly. They have done that in every sect. And because you are a scholar, I can understand your sympathy for scholars. Because I am not a scholar, I am more unsympathetic towards scholars than you. But not only scholars, even bhaktas of bhaktas. So Channabaswana says one of his bhaktas, if the whole world turns into bhakta, where is the place for Swarga, Martya and Patala? Kudala Channa Sangamayanalli Lakshakobba Bhakta Kotigobba Sharana. Only one in a million is a bhakta and only one in a billion is a sharana. It's not easy because you have to give up yourself. It's not meant to prop up your psychological ego or social ego. Allama puts it, Ondu kaiyali hullu, ondu kaiyali kolli, uri hottittu Gogeshwara nimma sharanana. He has hay, dry grass in one hand and torch in one hand. When the two combine, his whole body is burnt down. And that's why they talk about Uriyu karpuradodagadagiddante ananinnode kudasakamdeva. I should melt into you like the camphor melts into the flame. So this kind of political bhakti is different. That's why I said there are people who always use the sayings of or the heritage of bhaktas as cultural capital. This concept, cultural capital, was used by this famous French post-structuralist, I forget his name. He's the only one I like, I forget his name at the moment. So cultural capital. So there is now silence that passeth all understanding. So we conclude here. Yes.
ಗುರುವಿನ ಸ್ಥಾನ ಏನು ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಭಕ್ತನ ಬಗ್ಗೆ?
Yes, I forgot to mention. One of the, yes, good, thank you for this question. This is something that I didn't dwell on because I lost track of it. Bhakti, in all Bhakti traditions, Bhakti is directed towards the deity is one thing. And the Bhakti of genuine Bhaktas is another important thing. Kamalavi says, Sangadindallade Agni Uttado, Sangadindallade Nimma Sharanara Anubhavadindanu Paramasukiyadina Chandamallikarjuna. The Satsanga, which is emphasized in all spiritual traditions. Secondly, Guru. And Basavana himself says, ಮಡಿಕೆಯ ಮಾಡುವಡೆ ಮನ್ನೇ ಮೊದಲು ತೊಡಿಗೆಯ ಮಾಡುವಡೆ ಹೊನ್ನೇ ಮೊದಲು ಗುರು ಶಿವಪಥವನರಿವರೆ ಗುರುಪಥವೇ ಮೊದಲು. It's through Guru that one recognizes the divine in oneself, and Guru sows the seed, but ultimately the relationship between, and there are many Vachanas which praise the Guru. Akamadevi also says, ಭವಬಂಧನವ ತೆಗೆದು ಭವಿಯೆಂಬುದ ತೆಗೆದು ಭಕ್ತರನ್ನಾಗಿ ಮಾಡಿದ ಗುರುವೇ, ಭವಬಂಧನವ ತೆಗೆದು ಪರಮಸಿಕ ತೋರಿದ ಗುರುವೇ, ಚನ್ನಮಲ್ಲಿಕಾರ್ಜುನ ಗುರುವೇ. She identifies Arishta Chandamallikarjuna with Guru. So there are many of them. Ultimately, Guru should lead to the Guru within. The relationship with Guru and the disciple also comes to a point where it becomes Advaitic. Allamarpur says, Guruve Shishyanada Tanna Vinodakke, Shishyane Guruvada Tanna Vinodakke. Guruvimugu, Shishyangu, Audu Dura, Audu Sare. Ultimately, Guru was playing the role of Shishya for his fun, and Shishya was playing his role for his own fun. And then there's no difference. But these days, in our spiritual traditions, Guru is a principle, not a person. But the lay society hero worships individual gurus. That's why all kind of spiritual thugs are born. The Guru institutionalized, hero worshipped, then you have all these import quality, export quality gurus. So we conclude that, I think.